Okay, so hi everyone. Hope you're good. We're gonna hold this call for everyone in representation. It's a small group, but as it's a kind of Sunday, probably Sunday, I think Sunday morning there. Yeah, a lot of people are gonna be busy, but they will be watching this. For me, it's an important call. Una talked about the interest in working with music, working with systems. And now is the time to maybe back these practical systems with a lot of philosophy and a lot of theory. As this is the last 3 months intensive that we're holding, it falls on us to make this more coherent and cohesive. So we're starting in the 3rd month this coming week. So we put a lot of things together, and I think the discussion would be very interesting for those who have been in the process, have been practicing, have been studying. Those are two things, right? It's either you've been practicing or studying, or it's both. The more you practice, the more you understand, but the more you study, obviously, the more you understand. So we're both practicing and we're studying. And as you know, there's a lot happening in our circles that's to do with schools, with hospitals, even with prisons. And the studying part becomes a lot more important. Actually, like practice has to slow down when we work with these institutions, which are for us really interesting. Just so I think that's more in line with we need to be open that the way we hold the energy won't exactly be the same as what we're used to. It could be so automatic when you talk about inner dance, Kundalini, this life force energy, that the way you would hold it is the way you know it. But nothing is set in stone. So we want to be interested in how would this change so that an inner dance process within a hospital may not be the same as like a high school or a kindergarten, or like in a prison, which someone like Sophie, for example, is interested in the Belgian experience. We've been taking in a lot of feedbacks from around the world lately, and a lot of the feedbacks are interesting. Some of them are about the changes that are happening energetically with the way we're holding music, for example. There are different experiences there that seem unique. Maybe I can ask Sophie to talk about this a little bit, because she's in the front line. Actually, there's 2 women in Belgium who have been looking at these changes, and I'm really curious about it because it's not easy to go into the new music. It's actually really scary for the space holder because it kind of shocks the bodies of people. But when one stays in the set of possibilities, there's a lot that can be learned, and suddenly something new opens up. So Sophie, maybe you can share a little bit about what it's been like for you. It'd be interesting for a lot of us to hear.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, hi. So I'm Sophie, and I'm a facilitator here in Belgium, in a small village between Antwerp, Brussels, and Ghent. It's just in between. And I facilitate every week. And when Pi started with the new playlist, myself about the playlist, and they irritated me at the beginning. And so it was the people who were in the session, they were irritated too. It was like afterwards I understood. Oh, yeah. So she was moving her shoulder a lot. And the day afterwards, she sent me a picture doing this. that she hadn't been able to do in 6 years. So I started to trust that kind of music as from that moment. And the crazy thing is the Sunday afterwards, I was facilitating again, and I was going to use, I think, one of the older playlists. And just before, because I was doubting, I really wanted to use the new music, but I was afraid of the reaction of the people. So I was still doubting what kind of playlist I will use just before the when I put up the music. And one girl who was sitting next to me just before I pushed play, or just before I said, now you can lay down, she said, just like, Sophie, when you use that kind of music, I really want to say to you that when you use that kind of playlist, when I hear the songs, it brings me back to the 3D. And for me, it was like a big sign. You need to put the new playlist. And it got me so confident. And so I said, okay, stop, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about what the new playlist is about. So afterwards, I told it to Pai, it was the most craziest experience. I had 2 pregnant women in that group. That girl who was sitting next to me who asked for new music, she was getting into the high bridge. I never saw that in one of my sessions. And her mom, who was there too, she had contact with aliens. So everyone, even there were 2 who were used to do CAP, who were there too. It was for me, the most beautiful session ever, because I got into the trust. Since then, even without listening to the new playlist, I just put them on. Like now, Pai had, just before I went on a vacation, you sent us a new online playlist. And without even hearing it, I put it the day before yesterday. And this evening, I'm so entrusted with those new playlists, because they are so big, so much bigger, and the people go so deep, and even I go deeper, because I have a lot of instruments in the place where I facilitate, but I never use them because I'm a little bit afraid of, when I use it, maybe people are going to get out of the experience. But now I don't stop using those instruments. I almost don't touch them anymore. I'm like with those instruments next to their ear, to their tummy. Yeah, I'm so grateful for those new music. And this evening I'm facilitating. It's always a group of 8. And only one girl has been in other sessions. The 7 other never have done inner dance. And normally I would use a playlist that I know. But now I know. I'm just going to put the new one, because I know they're going to be, it works. There's no doubt. So I'm very happy, because it makes a difference. The people, like Pai said, they're ready to go beyond the songs, because they have been living a lot of that. It's true. So now they're ready to go to the construction of it. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Like irritation is a big word I've been listening to when a lot of this is introduced. And the time that I heard this the most was when a Belgian lady, Christelle, was in Maya. She was the one who had this series of accidents that rendered her paralyzed with a broken brain for like two or 3 decades. Her brain was technically broken, and when she went to Maya, she really goes deep in inner dance after Yella introduced it to her, and then she came to Maya. It was really intense. Like when it hits her like a big truck. But in cases like these, it's really interesting because when people talk about the brain getting rewired, I think this is the most interesting feedback we can receive, that there's something happening in the brain that's changing the wirings. It means something, and that's something I want to talk about today. But at the same time, even though like Christelle from Belgium is getting really hit hard, she was super irritated, meaning the experience was really uncomfortable. Sometimes discomfort can be quite transformative. So she just kept with it. And it was practically her Belgian weird, damaged super brain that pushed a lot of these new playlists into being. We kept pushing her because she kept getting irritated, but we just kept pushing, like, okay, more and more. She kept getting irritated by the high pitched tones, for example. So I think all the more we just kept adding the high pitched tones. Then she hated the bass, the lower tones. So we just kept adding more bass. The next thing you know, we were adding so much bass and so much high pitched tones. And she was super irritated until a point that something blew. Something short circuited until she wasn't irritated anymore. And then it started to do things. So I'm glad for you to share, because you're something very rigid and very loose, very normalized and logical, but very alien and weird in the Belgian system, that I think is interesting for an inner dance conversation to happen. That's one of the reasons why I really want to get there, to see what we can blow open. I think there's breakthroughs there. So um, I, I responded to Sophie when she talked about this in full gratitude and appreciation. It's one thing to stay safe, to stay in a safe zone. Okay, I'm going to use some sweet songs and some emotional songs, some angry songs, and it's gonna be what people need to hear. That I think that's the easy way, because once people get settled into that, it becomes very circular, repetitive, and habitual. I had to explain this unexplainable energy again and again to so many people, so many different types of people across nationalities, conservative or super liberal. And every time I had to do it, it was really hard because this wasn't known. But every time I had to do it, the more I think I grew. So I think the more you're having to explain something that's hard to explain, I think there's growth. And these new playlists are going to force people to explain something that doesn't sound like music, that doesn't seem pleasing. I think there's a high success rate once you're able to land this in your group. But what Sophie is saying is you have to do this inside yourself. You have to try out this new brain. You know, it's not just the music. It's like this new brain that's not familiar. It's not something almost of this world. And we're lucky that we might have certain participants, like the one who spoke to Sophie. Could you please not play some of those emotional songs, because it keeps bringing me back to my head or my body space. It's addictive. Because I think it's good to be pushed somehow. So I appreciate the story a lot, and I'm really glad that we can actually understand this. This is not an easy place to be, primarily because I think the ones that would work for doctors and for schools would in fact be these more radical playlists. We're not going to play these song-based playlists to hospital systems. It somehow doesn't work as a vibratory medicine. The new systems would be more vibratory. So this lady who was going through all these weird, irritating, mind-blowing experiences in Maya, when she went back to Belgium, like she underwent this radical transformation. I don't know if I talked about her before, but after her accident 30 years ago, she couldn't do parallel movements with her arms. Like she couldn't raise left and right at the same time. She can't do this. You know, whenever she tries to do this, this goes down, and then this goes down. So after a few inner dances in Maya, she could do this, and she was really shocked. So there's so many changes that have been happening that her people can't believe the miracle that's at work. But what's all the more amazing is she started to use this in the therapy she's been holding for her clients. Like in Belgium, like she's been handling these top football athletes from Belgium whom are superstars, and she's putting these new playlists to these super athletes, and it's becoming really, really popular lately. So especially the last one, Synthesis, I practically made it for her because of the intensities that she was coming from. I was imagining what would it take for something to organize Christelle, super weird Belgian, superpower Belgian brain. And so she's been landing this in Brussels, and it seems to be people want it. People actually want this, but it was the same thing. People were irritated in the beginning, so I think it needs to be said. Every time you land a new style, Italy went through that. A lot of other people went through that when they started to introduce the Womb Broom track or the whale song, and then the noise app. When you introduce these simple things, you're already in the precipice. You're at the edge of music into noise, and then noise into vibration. You're pushing people's boundaries already so that they could cross over into other dimensions. So I'd like to talk about these. I think we're switching spaces. So hospitals and schools are symbolically good in a way that the playlists for a school would be really different with a playlist for a hospital. Hospital is a space where you let go and throw things away out of sheer toxicity, like things that got stored in the body by way of emotions or mental systems or physiological systems. This is where people throw things out. In a school, this is where people put things in. So when Una talks about construction as opposed to what? Like deconstruction, the playlisting is actually quite different. So the new playlists are in fact more constructive. So you will hear more feedback mechanisms in people where it seems like connections are being made. They're not just designed for people to cry, to go into emotive states. They're there more for like stages of learning and stages of growth. So I'm going to go into the board today to talk us through different wait, let me clean up. Modes of understanding in inner dance. I've been interested in the brain for a while, and the brain is complex, but okay, so let's say you looked at subcategories. One of the interesting proposals into brain theory that seemed legitimately appropriate for the inner dance is Paul MacLean's triune brain theory. He proposed that there were three parts of the brain. So this isn't entirely accepted in the neurosciences, but a lot of people do accredit that this makes sense. So there's the cerebral cortex or the neocortex, which is responsible for higher order, like thinking. And then you have the reptilian brain. This is a good starting point, I think. We can start with this. The reptilian brain is more for like instinct, right? Like, it's a way of thinking that's very animal-based. And reptiles don't really have a neocortex. So it's kind of an interesting name to give. And then he proposed, which was unique for the time he brought this up, the second brain, the middle brain would be the emotional brain. So this is his proposal that you have these three domains that are different brain parts. So when you conduct inner dance, when you trigger the reptilian brain, for example, The reptilian brain is very much that which is responsible for movement. So the part that's reptilian would be more the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is made up of the nucleus accumbens, which is responsible for motor functions. One thing interesting in the basal ganglia would be the ventral tegmental area. Don't get afraid of that term. That simply means that the part that produces dopamine, which is responsible for motivations and addictions, it's part of that. So when you conduct inner dance, when you conduct processes, if you're going to stay within the reptilian brain, then it's all about body movements, kundalini movements, and as well like dopamine, the dopamine hit, the neurotransmitter that just keeps people in an addictive loop. So we haven't talked about the neocortex a lot, but the limbic system would come up as a very, very interesting aspect. And let me talk about that. Why would the limbic system be interesting? So, okay, the limbic system is responsible for emotions. Very, very often, I speak about, okay, I'll show my camera. I speak about the soft part of the brain at the back. I don't know how much you're interested in that, how much you're attracted to it when you're holding space. But when I hold space, historically, I'm usually going for the back of the head. And for a long time, I was mapping that out as the striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia. But more and more over the last years, when I have been exploring, okay, what is there? What is here that allows for an in-depth experience of the inner dance? And a lot of that has actually influenced the way I hold and construct the music. I'm beginning to be convinced that this is not just reptilian. It's not just the brainstem. And I've talked a lot about this, that there's this part of the limbic system that is very responsible for so many inner dance phenomena, the hypothalamus. You want to understand this brain region. It's a brain region. It's not just a brain part. It contains like a lot of different elements that you would activate when you ask people to lay down. Like, for example, one of them, as often talked about, is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which coordinates REM state. You know, when you're supposed to get sleepy, then the SCN, or suprachiasmatic nucleus, talks to the pineal gland to send melatonin to get you sleepy. And when you ask people to lay down, you're activating the SCN. Hypothalamus is responsible for breath rate or breath depth. It's responsible for the heartbeat. So as you can see, it's responsible for a lot of very reptilian functions. One thing interesting about the hypothalamus is that very recently, it's actually, we're learning that it's hosting emotions, especially fear, and especially aggression. So if you're dealing with this inside yourself or others, the hypothalamus contains a region called the ventral medial hypothalamus. It's pear-shaped. When you trigger deep emotion, like strong emotion, what you're actually triggering is this. The hypothalamus could also trigger stress. As we talked about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis as well, okay, when facilitators tend to go for the what do you call this again? The yellow chakra, the solar plexus. You know, you see a lot of facilitators liking to press the solar plexus. It seems like they're trying to trigger that, but the initial trigger is in fact to get that going. It's still going to begin in the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus triggers the adrenal cortex, the adrenaline gland. You talk about adrenaline or epinephrine, a lot of it needs to begin in the hypothalamic area. So lastly, okay, the hypothalamus regulates the autonomic nervous system, which we talk so much about. And that which regulates the autonomic nervous system, which is hypothalamic as well, is the circadian rhythms. So when you look at this, everything inner dance actually stops here. You know, all of these things, whether it be emotions, whether it be the breath stopping or going deeper, heartbeat going faster or slower, going to the dream state, going to the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, and Una talking about the circannual rhythms, the seasons of light and dark, hot and cold. The circadian rhythms is regulated by this and this one region. Okay, so this is the inner dance region in a way. It's the space at the back of your head. And if you activate this, you will bring people into the many states that are talked about. So, okay, once you have this, right, this could give us a look into emotional or animal intelligence. Were we to bring up this word like intelligence. Intelligence in this way that's body-based. In the ANS, it's autonomic. It's the intuitive body intelligence. It's not thinking. It's thinking on its own. It's instinctive. It's animal. It's the thing that just knows what to do. That's entirely, especially body-based. That's one part. We've studied this over and over again in many trainings. These are the intelligences that we look at. But when you read into this, okay, this is good from a spiritual workshop perspective. This could have interesting elements for healers because we would know how release, how waves, how rhythms take place, but it's not really complete in a way that you still would need to go back to the triune brain. We're not just interested in this part that explains how motor functions work. A lot of our explanations regarding the dopaminergic or dopamine cycles talks about how body moves according to our addictions, our behaviors, and motivations. What I just went over is an explanation of the limbic system, which is emotional. Okay, so emotions can be intelligent, right? They can help us regulate our systems, but it doesn't allow us an explanation of how do we actually formulate thought. How do you form a thought? How do you formulate a judgment? How do you formulate like a concept? Where do ideas come from? So given the fact that we're working a lot with schools today, and I do believe that when we do work with hospitals, we would still need to think about intelligence in a way that when you just work with the body, it's not really holistic. You need to understand how do people begin to think in a holistic, integrative, and healthy way. So without an understanding of the neocortex, in a way, it's still kind of incomplete. You know, like a lot of us are probably attracted to our dialogues because we do get tired of just activating the body. So, okay, I know how to trigger the body. I can make people cry. I can make people shout. I can press certain buttons and they can go into a catharsis. They can release. They can act like animals. They can become like serpents and reptiles. But how do we create like alien intelligence? How do we get them to, you know, go into interdimensional, you know, interplanetary awareness? Like, where does genius come in? You know, how do we get people to brilliance, not just creative for the sake of art's sake, but how do we get people to wisdom? right? So an understanding of the neocortex is being asked for, and I've been slowly trying to make my way into this. When we went to Europe last year, we were talking a lot about synaptic connections, myelination of synapses, so that if we know how to fire a circuit, if you know how to allow neurons to fire together, what does it mean that you can let them wire together so you can form a new thought? You know, when you deal with electricity, for sure, you can fire them, okay? Fire them up. But it's a whole different art form to know how to construct these networks so that they, you know, these networks can become thoughts. So let's go into a conversation about that. I think this would be interesting. This would really delve more into the indigo set of possibilities in the inner dance. So so what is the neocortex? Say if you let's say you remove the neocortex. The neocortex in your brain isn't so thick. You know, when you see the brain, it's almost all neocortex that you see, except for a few parts that are protruding, and then you see the brainstem. But almost all that you see is the neocortex. It's a thin layering. You know, it's only about 2.5 millimeters thick, which is quite small, but it covers the whole brain, so that it probably makes up about half of the volume of your whole brain. So that's technically where intelligence is happening, the thing that's covering things up. So it's color gray, and underneath that would be the white matter. So for me, that's a really interesting part, because all of your thoughts are networked throughout this neocortex. It's one interesting thing about it is, even though there are many regions, like we talk about the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, we all have this general understanding that vision happens here. Motor functions happen somewhere at the bottom of the brain. And sensations happen more or less here. Language and some motor control happens here. So we know a lot of this is mapped out, but structurally, what's interesting about the neocortex is structurally, it's all the same all throughout. So even though you have different regions, all these regions actually look the same all throughout the whole thing. So if you, let's say, rip out the neocortex and flatten it on a table, you know what a dinner napkin looks like. It's quite big, and it, you know, imagine it was that big, it would cover that area. And then it would be, if you flatten it, it would be 2.5 millimeters thick. When you try to study it, it looks the same everywhere, all throughout. So it's really interesting. How do you construct the part that can see visions and can hear sounds? So think of it as a whole area where thought is networked across very, very similar regions. What makes these regions different is how circuits are formed. So they may look the same, but the way you circuit them, you can modify certain parts. So when people say, okay, my brain seems to be changing, one possible explanation is that you are changing the circuits without modifying the structure. You're changing the way things are wired so that you can assign more vision or more audition, more tactition being the sense of touch across the cerebral cortex. So a lot of you will have been experiencing changes in your brain. One explanation would be that you're changing the circuitry in the neocortex. You're rewiring. When you talk about rewiring, a lot of the rewiring happens in the outer layer. So the outer layer is gray, and the layer beneath that is white. The reason why it's white is it's myelin, which allows signals to travel a lot faster and a lot quicker as compared to in the gray area. So the white area underneath the gray area is more responsible for complex thought. So the neocortex could host conversations on how thinking begins. And a lot of it actually is kind of inner dancey. It doesn't seem so in the beginning when you think, okay, thought doesn't really happen in inner dance. But that's not true. Actually, like hyper thinking happens in inner dance. Besides that, also original thought, or the origin of thought before it becomes, like the kind of thought that we experience as thought, worrisome thought, over planning thought, overthinking thought, linear thought. So let's say, don't really know how to, oh, I don't really know how to draw this, but let's say this is the neocortex if you flatten it out over a napkin. What's interesting, let's say it's 2.5 millimeters thick. Let's say that's the thickness. For us to imagine how it functions, the whole thing acts as a kind of grid. Okay, so it would be a lot more than this, but let's say this is what it looks like, and you can imagine dividing and subdividing the neocortex into a grid. So this would be a horizontal representation. But if you were to take a very, very, very small part of the neocortex, let's say keep dividing it, keep dividing it, keep dividing it, and you're left with maybe a millimeter square area. Okay, let's extract that. That millimeter square area would be called a cortical column. Okay, a cortical column would be a vertical representation of a very small part of the area of the neocortex. Spell that out, cortical column. And I want to explain to you why this is kind of inner dance based. So what comprises a cortical column? So there's basically around 6 layers of the neocortex. Some are more stable, some are more unstable. But there are 2 major types of neurons or cells in the cortical column. And a lot of this would be let's clean this up a bit. So let's say this is a cortical column. And it would look like this. So in the higher part would be where sensory inputs would come in. Okay, I'll explain what that means later. And then the lower part is where inner dance often plays a part. That's where movement is registered. So say sensory would mean either the things that you see, the things that you hear, the things that you especially touch, right? The things that you taste, the things that you smell. A lot of it would enter into an area or a region in the neocortex within the cortical column. And what is responsible for mapping that out would be called the place cells, okay? And then there is also an area in the cortical column in the neocortex that's responsible for mapping movement, okay? Oh, sorry, what did I just do? I need to, I wanted to erase the mapping part. And what's responsible for that are called the grid cells. Okay, so this requires some explanation as to why this is even relevant at all. So place cells are responsible for taking in everything that you're sensing in the world. You can smell it, you can see it. You need to be able to define a particular object based on what is there. So let's say you can close your eyes and then you can touch your pen, or you can touch the table. Even if you don't see it, you know that it's there based on what your senses are telling you. So as a thought or body experiment, try touching the table with one finger and then imagine what might be happening in your neocortex that's sensing the table. Let's say beforehand, you didn't know it was there. What would be the difference of you doing that as opposed to using 2 fingers or using 3 fingers, 5 fingers, or 10 fingers? So the more you're able to work through the surfaces of this thing, the more you're able to create what is basically called a oh, sorry, it's messy here. A reference frame. Okay, so your neocortex is organized across like countless reference frames, so that if you saw it before, if you ever saw a table, if you ever saw a mom, you ever saw a baby, you ever saw a tree, you need to build a model that's called a reference frame based on what you touched. And based on what you saw, based on what you heard, based on what you smelled, based on what you tasted. So in many ways, babies don't have reference frames. They haven't really tasted, heard, or seen that before. The information might be embedded in the DNA, but they haven't really structured the thing as an object. They haven't organized the neocortex in a way that they can make a reference to something. Now, based on everything that you know, you don't have one model of a tree or a car or a pen or a table. You have thousands, tens of thousands for each object that you ever saw, meaning you have so many variations of everything, and they're all lodged in the neocortex. Now, what makes the neocortex partially interesting is just that. What is interesting would be the fact that the grid cells register not just how you're sensing the thing in terms of the properties of the objects. The grid cells basically tell you the relationship of your own body with the thing that you're looking at. So in many ways, place cells answer the question like, what am I looking at? And grid cells answer more the question, where is it in relationship with where I am at the moment. So what is amazing about the neocortex is, number one, neuroscientists have been looking at this quite recently, actually. We're realizing that thinking is a form of movement. All right? To establish a cortical column, you not only need to integrate what you're sensing about the object, you also need to move your body so that you can relate to it through space. So when people say the word holding space, there's an actual meaning of that in relation to how the neocortex works. You cannot basically know a thing without moving or dancing with it. You need to move your body. You need to dance. You need to have a relationship that's spatial in nature, so that, let's say, you can think of a coffee cup or a fork. You can't really hold the concept of food completely or beverage without experiencing this act of taking this thing and moving it into your mouth and then drinking or eating the thing. Your body needs to have a story, and the story needs to be embodied. So thinking is a form of movement. Movement is a form of thinking. So you might want to say, no, thinking is separate from movement. The brain would disagree, because interestingly, a lot of neural pathways, a lot of synapses that establishes seeing the thing is actually connected to the thing that moves your body in accordance to the thing. So for example, the part of your eyes, the part of your brain that registers what you're seeing when you use your eyes is actually connected to the part of the brain that moves your eyes. That's kind of amazing. The part of your ears that registers the sounds that you're absorbing from the external environment is connected to the part of your neck that would move your head. There's no separation. And what we're finding out is that all of the senses are like this. The part of the area that registers taste is connected to the muscle control that moves your tongue and your mouth. So what you take in is very connected to what you put out. So the way you dance, the way you move your body is very much connected to how you sense the world. You can't separate it. So when you observe bodies, moving in inner dance, whether it be physical movement or energetic movement. When you talk about the mind undergoing a transformation, you cannot discredit space. You know, like if you want to change a person, you want to change their mind, they need to also change their movement. They need to change their place in the world. So you really want to place importance on how bodies are positioned. It sounds really simple when you think of it this way, but it's not. How a body experiences itself as something big or small, or a lot of this would be expressed in how people would conduct their body language. So it's really quite radical for many neuroscientists, psychiatrists, psychologists to understand that the body and the mind are one. And so intelligence, even though it's, you know, in the neocortex, a lot of it's actually still connected to the limbic system and the reptilian brain. That the reptilian brain and the limbic system is basically called the old brain, and the neocortex is called the new brain. So basically, we built the new brain on top of the old brain, and the way we did that began with movement. You know, from the most basic organisms all the way to the reptiles, we had to dance and move, experience the world through the outer dance, and then slowly we could build the neocortex, which would be responsible for things like thought, learning, and memory. So both are important. You'd be interested in all of these, and these new findings around the neocortex, around this cortical column, would be really, really interesting. So when you talk about music, for example, or when you touch bodies, when you hold bodies, these insights would be really relevant, because when you connect certain types of music together, that's how you create a circuit, right? So it's not just playing one music and only one music. Inner dance usually does not happen when you just play one kind of music. You can either play music all together in one layering, which is how these new playlists are constructed, or you can do it traditionally by creating a succession from one musical form to another. There's a lot of wisdom in that, you know, following one song from one to the other. Why and how? One more complex way of understanding the cortical column, let's clean this up, is that the neocortex, which is made up of these hundreds of thousands of cortical columns, right? What you're doing is basically you're allowing the horizontal connections between one or two, or maybe millions of cortical columns with each other, so that the more you're able to connect one column with another, and then this one connects to that, and then maybe there's a lot more columns over there. That's how you establish thought. Thought is complex, and a lot of what you sense, say sensory input, happens over here at the top, and the many movements you've made as a human being and as an animal are registered here. The more you create these connections, the more you establish like consciousness. So what is interesting about this in relation to how thought forms is there needs to be somehow a succession, still some kind of linearity where one connection would follow another. So in this way, thought as established within the neocortex is predictive in nature. Okay, prediction is a really important concept when we think about causation and retrocausality. Like I don't know, like in your phone, I don't know if you have an iPhone, but when you're registering these older versions of iPhones where you touch, the finger, what do you call it? The fingerprint touch ID. And then you need to register your thumbprint. So you need to give many angles. so that it registers it completely. It needs all the angles, and it sometimes takes like seconds or minutes. Or when I did my visa application at the embassy the other week, I had to do that. They had to tell, okay, we need more of those sides and the other sides. So this is more of a basic. This is more of a basic explanation of how the cortical columns interrelate with each other, so that when you walk into a room and then you're looking at something, in the beginning it's not very clear, but then the more you take it in and then you like it, the more you start to register that this is a thing. So this sounds really simple in a way, but when the things first enter your brain, the so-called things, you're not actually registering the object. What you're registering is like fuzzy lines, like shapes, and it's not very clear. It's very, very fuzzy. What the neocortex does is it builds a picture of the world that's not actually there. Do you know what I mean? The world isn't real in the way that it's really there. You through the art of prediction make up an image of the world so that it would look coherent, it would look stable, so that there's a reason in inner dance why we ask people to lay down and close their eyes. Because the way to change the world, we actually need to erase how people might see it. The world just seems real. So when people mention these like descriptions like 3D, like the world is real, you know, when we make judgments, it actually really becomes helpful to understand that when you, for example, when you look at the visual cortex, the larger part of the visual cortex is called V1 and V2. The more complex images that would come into the visual cortex would come in V3 or V4, but most of your visual cortex, V1 and V2, which is larger, it doesn't see pictures, it sees fuzzy lines. So when people in the inner dance process see lines, shapes, in a way, this is what objects actually really look like if you weren't using your prediction capacity that lays in your neocortex. So in other words, this is a really scary thought. A lot of the things that you see are making it up. You're making it up. You're building a picture of the world inside when in fact maybe it doesn't actually look like that from another dimensionality. And you know what? It's the same thing with audition. A lot of the things that you hear are integrations taking place inside you. They're basically systems of interpretation that might not sound the same to a dog, a cow, a lizard, or a baby, or someone experiencing dementia, or someone who took magic mushrooms, or someone who's in inner dance. You know, so in a way, we're deconstructing. In many ways, we're actually deconstructing what the ego, personality, or the neocortex likes to integrate, so that it, sorry about that, so that you would have a stable picture of the world, so that you can interact with the world. The thing is, when people aren't so happy with the world as they see it, there is a reason why the pictures of the world undergo a weirding or a strangifying. So that's how new intelligence would later come up. There would be implications around what we're speaking about at the moment, primarily because some people can now express different dimensionalities of what they see, so things don't seem the same. You know, sometimes the eyes, the retina of the eye undergo changes. Maybe you've experienced some of this, where the things that you're looking at don't exactly look the way they did. And sometimes people after experiences, they say this, like some people say, I can't see anything, or, oh, I see colors I haven't seen before, or, you know, like it takes a little bit of a while for them to go back into normal vision. Prediction, going back to prediction, for you to successfully do that, you actually need to. Sorry, I need to keep doing this. The Zoom pop-up stuff is for you to successfully make a prediction, you need to undergo a voting process. Okay, there every time you see something or hear something, smell something, there is a process called process voting. So that okay, remember, like, this is your neocortex, and it's filled with all these cortical columns. For you to make a decision, for you to decide what the thing is, a lot of these need to activate and come together so that aha, okay, period. That's like a birthday cake, or that's a hot dog, or that's a, it's there's a kind of judgment that needs to happen for you to decide what something is. And there are specific neurons that are practically there just for voting. They're like voting neurons scattered across several more stable layers of the neocortex. Which is to say, and this is really, really interesting for energy people out there, the nature of reality is not stable. Stability is an illusion. So that even when it looks like what you're looking at is stable, that stability is your imagination. The truth of what you're sensing is everything's actually always moving. And through the powers given to you by the neocortex, whenever you establish a thought, that's what it means to normalize within the three-dimensional reality. Like, we practically found a way to stabilize our perception of the external world because things were really, really chaotic. But in truth, the nature of the world actually is like energy. It's a whole bunch of vibrations. So the human brain was really well designed to stop the movement, to make it appear like this room that you're in is just like a room. You have to thank your brain for that. So it did that as explained in the cortical column explanation through developing, once again, the ability to sense, okay, and then the ability to locate. Okay, this is really what is important here. It's location, location, location. You know how they say that in marketing. It's really about how you create a sense of place. So that once you know, okay, this is what it is, awareness and intelligence really needs to understand, like, where is it located. So for you to understand something, it needs to place it somewhere. Okay, the grid, once again, the grid cells are responsible for that, and the place cells are responsible for internal relationships of the characteristics within the object itself. Okay, like, what is let's say this is an object. What is the object made of? Okay, there's this part, this part, this part, this part, and then it can make a decision on what that is. But for you to have a more complete knowing, you need to know where is it in relation to me. It needs to be somehow networked across this this whole ocean or field of many objects.
I'm not sharing the screen if you were drawing.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, that's true. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, like when you position people in a room in the inner dance, it's actually quite important to tell them, okay, locate yourself, find your place in the room. Because most of the time, in a lot of workshops, people just lay their yoga mats there. Okay, you lay down there, maybe because the room is small and limited and you need to optimize. But for me, I really like spreading things out, so you never know how things would look like. It's like my only instructions is make sure that when you're laying down, you don't hit someone, you don't kick someone in the face, or you're not too near, let's say, the wall, meaning you want to give them as much space, but location, placement, proprioception in the room is really, really important in order to allow people to find their own place, and the freedom to move across the field freely is quite important. But it really goes beyond that. Like a lot of the things that you do when you hold bodies, when you extend the arms, when you even touch them on a specific body part, or when you use certain types of music, even words have an effect of displacing location that might be holding them in a particular mental domain. And if you want them to move, you almost sometimes need to shock them so that they would relocate or displace what might be located in a particular corner that they're not really happy with. So a lot of that is mapped out in the neocortex. So you want to always maybe imagine that there's this huge map that's the person. You know, you don't just see them as, okay, here's another body walking into the room, but this is actually like a map. And for me to bring them into the cosmic or the quantum, you need to allow them to sense the world, right? So cortical column has sensory inputs, and then you want them to locate themselves differently. So rather than just pressing buttons, location is something I've found a lot more important over the years. The way I position the body locates the body. I don't just like triggering emotions. What I like to do is think about how the mind, which is in the body, is reshaped so that the body can become bigger. You know, so I place a lot more importance in positioning the body, much more than I try to trigger the body so that an energy shoots up. I'm much more interested in what does consciousness look like? What is the shape? You know, what is the form? And how do I reform or transform the shape of you know, so I try not to use my visual input totally, because when I'm just looking at the body, I'm judging, okay, the body is there, it has bones, it has skin. But I try to imagine what does this consciousness look like? We are trapped with the fact that the body is a sensory motor thing, so that, you know, small changes in the position would actually also reposition the mind, like in a way. So this is freeing. This could help people a lot when you try to imagine location, relativity between, you know, understanding even that certain concepts are interconnected or intertwined with each other. So one concept can only really exist with other concepts. So that when you say a word and that becomes connected to another word, that already creates a circuit or a bridge. But when you create unexpected conceptualizations, that actually allows people to expand their mind. When you create these boring, repetitive, okay, you know, you want to free your heart, open your heart. A lot of those are kind of obvious within a spiritual workshop. But when you bring in something unexpected, something resonant, yet something quite different from how they normally see it, that as words, as semanticity already has a way of expanding the territory. So hopefully this allows you to see the body, not just as a physical body, but as a kind of mapping. Okay, so what would be the other interesting ways to understand the map? Okay, so because when you think of the neocortex just as a 2.5 millimeter thick, big as a dinner napkin, cortical columns here and there, there's a homogeneity there, or the structural sameness would seem confusing. But maybe one interesting thing to think about is there are different ways information is networked. So there's like the iconic network. So there's the visual network, like everything anyone has ever seen is mapped there. And then you have the echoic network, okay? Because I'm a bad artist, I'm gonna have to tell you this is an ear. And then you have the semantic network. So those are words. meanings. So in inner dance, mostly what we use is the echoic network, and the iconic network being more images. It's important to understand that when people are more visual, what happens is that the nature of information networking tends to be more limited. That's what images do. So when you see a thing, the information becomes more localized. Even though a specific image could be built by numerous cortical networks, numerous reference frames, the localization powers of image is not the same as the regionalizing powers of sound. When you use sound, connections between information bits and pieces tend to range much farther and much faster. So that's the reason why we're asking people to close their eyes, which then actually brings up icons, you know, symbols later on when it's time. So when you think of things like these, what you get somehow is that the neocortex is an integration space where sight, smell, touch, taste, what else is there? Put sound. They integrate here, so that imagine these not as neurons or cortical columns. Imagine these are synapses where there are trillions of connections. Like all of these are interrelated to each other, and some regions would be more gustatory, tactile, visual, or audio based. So the more you can create interconnections between these, all the more you bring people into the baby mind, right? So the more these interconnect, the more they become babies. But so that's useful within the healing process or the spiritual awakening process. When you try to establish learning, when you try to establish people can formulate new thoughts, then you need to somehow allow for more linear processing to happen. So that's maybe the point where you start using songs again, or start speaking certain words, so on and so forth. So we want to understand, how do you formulate a thought? Okay, so let's imagine from a super oversimplified way that this is a neuron. So when you want to create a circuit, you want to fire these neurons with each other. So axon will meet with dendrite, which is the ends of a synapse, and obviously there are a lot more neurons that want to connect to each other. So you want to fire them, and the more you fire them, you wire them. You can't wire them without firing them. So first you fire, and then they wire. That's called Hebbian learning. That's the most basic neural explanation of how learning happens. They all I don't know why they all disappear when maybe that's okay. So it cleans up. Maybe this is a lot more complex, and you're always firing. So right now, listening to me, you're firing concepts together, ideas together. So the question is, how do you create specific connections? And I just want to bring this up because in Studios Mundos, there was a lot of discussion in the last week over the concept of depression. What does depression actually mean from internal states? Not just romanticizing depression is, okay, you're sad for a long time, you don't have energy. Depression happens neuronally. So the terminology there would be more of long-term depression as opposed to long-term potentiation. And I think what's interesting about this is here's where you can start to connect the more animal part of the brain to the more thinking or cerebral mode thinking part of the brain. So long-term depression happens when you stop the possibility that this neuron can travel to that neuron, you know. So when you try to remove a connection, long-term depression could happen, so that that this particular neuron has not fired for a long time, maybe since you were a fetus or a baby, you haven't fired this particular connection. So that's when you would hold maybe what's called a long-term depression. So the question is, why does that happen? In many ways, trauma could be an explanation. So let's say you experienced a long time ago, like ouch, that wasn't nice. That was really painful. I didn't like that. So here's where emotion could lead to effects in the thinking process. And this sounds simple, but it's actually quite profound to understand that emotion is a form of thinking. So every time you experience something unpleasant, you will take away the potentiation or the potentiality for a connection to take place. And for that reason, the 100 billion connections in the brain become limited, are pruned, so that now you only have the 50 billion neurons, primarily because of fear, because you're not okay to creating some of the synaptic wirings that leads to that which isn't cool, that which is not very pleasant. Okay, so the terminologies within the cognitive sciences that express this is spike time dependent plasticity. Okay, the only thing this explains is that there are numerous things that this could explain. One would be that when neurons fire together, they're not usually synchronous. There has to be a specific direction, like one fires first before the other would receive, or then maybe fire into other directions. It could be here or it could be there. But normally, if you have like all of these neurons, all of these neurons mapped out together, they can't fire in the same direction all at once, you know, because you have quadrillion connections. Even in the cortical column, within each you know, 1 square millimeter of the neocortex, each of these, you know, tiny parts, each of these square millimeters already contains millions of synaptic connections. So you simply cannot handle too many connections. And for that reason, you have what's called a personality, an identity, or an ego, because it's not really so useful to think like a baby or like a fetus or like a bacteria or like a crocodile or something like that. It's really important that you prune away this chaos so that some kind of order would exist. And for that reason, like ego exists. And you want to thank spike time dependent plasticity. You want to thank long-term potentiation, and you want to thank long-term depression that allows you to figure out how do I wire my brain so that I'm not just going to be an unlimited baby animal creature. I can become like a person that knows what it needs, knows what it wants. You know, that in many ways is very integrative. It's a whole. It's like one whole thing. It's like you know, you're like a Caro, you're like an Isabel, you're like an Una or a Gisli or a Sophie or an Italy. So in many ways, this gives us a base. I just need to turn on the lights, sorry. Yeah, I need to see the blackboard in my computer. So what does this hold for inner dance? I mean, those basic things could already hold a lot for inner dance, but I think where this becomes interesting for inner dance is based on the question, how do you establish a directionality? How do you establish that one thing fires first and goes to the next? And then what does this have to say around the question, how do we establish thought? Okay. So basically, I mean, the most basic understanding of this would be, she's downstairs. You can't find her. It's too dark. Okay, go to your brother and ask for help because daddy's in a call. So one basic explanation for how this works is normally the body starts first, and then a thought follows. A body that experiences through the senses concrete information, things that are in the world that are real. So, for example, a baby would need to move across the room, feel the room, see what it tastes like, smells like, feels like, looks like, sounds like, and then it would establish an abstract thought. An abstract is a thing that does not physically exist in the world, like freedom, truth, love, could be experiential based on how we initially felt the world from a concrete sensory experience. So already this turns Descartes on his head when he said, I think, ergo I am. What Descartes didn't trust was the senses. So you're turning this into maybe a triangulation where I sense, therefore I think, therefore I am. So in this particular interpretation within the cognitive sciences, the body comes first, and then thought would arise, and then being would come from that. So when you think of the neocortex in this way, I'm not necessarily saying this is right. This is a current interpretation in the philosophies and the sciences. I'm not trying to draw a pattern here. I'm just trying to make a lot of dots. One explanation of how the neocortex works is you've basically stored from the sense inputs and the many ways you might have moved your body, not just in your life, but also throughout all your stored incarnations, stored in the body. Concrete experiences have then interconnected these cortical columns together, establishing thought. So were you to believe in this, which does hold true if you weren't discrediting that you have a body, if you do have a body, were you to try to change your thoughts, you would need to create transformations in a way that your body had formulated connections between sensory inputs and placements. And that's quite huge because it took a lot of time to program you. One of the reasons why we conduct inner dance that allows you to establish new emotions, new locations would still be true because you are moving your body like in a different way. You're experiencing different spatial relationships, relative relationships in your body, so that you can establish a new thought. Now, let me remind you that when you first receive sensory inputs, the actual inputs are fuzzy. They're not real. So you thought are decisions that you had made later on, maybe beginning when you were 3 years old or 4 years old, up until you were 7, when you made certain decisions about how certain things look like, understanding that most of your brain patterns would be situated by the time you're 6 years old, then there's a reason why we want to become baby-like once again. that experiences emotions anew, locations anew, so that we need to go back to when decisions were made that this is something that looks like this and is located there, and so on and so forth. Now, I think one interesting thought that's been around in the inner dance is evolutionary and developmental. What do I mean by this? I don't want to draw this out. I want to talk about it. Why does the body move like that in the inner dance? Here's one explanation of what it means to become a baby. We do need a screen for this. To a baby, thought is very different to an adult. And in a way, you actually reach adulthood at the age of somewhere between 3 to 7 years old. I don't want to write it because when I try to erase this, it's going to erase the whole thing. How do you become an adult? What does it mean to come from here and then to go from there? What does it mean? Now, an adult knows how to think. So the question is, do babies think? Do babies think? In developmental psychology, they don't. And there's an explanation of this. So babies can think. It's just that they cannot think internally. So for you to become an adult, you need to be able to internalize thought. You need to be able to think inside, and babies cannot think inside. They can only think outside. And this is something they exhibit through baby talk or baby language. So when babies think, they're always expressing themselves externally. To a baby, everything is authentically always expressed outside, meaning everything that they think about is in the public domain. So one way for you to cross the bridge from baby to adult is you need to be able to internalize thought so that you are thinking inside. So one explanation of what happens in the inner dance when adults start to move or express authentically, they're becoming like babies. Dimensionally, babies are always moving everything they're thinking. And when adults become secretive, private creatures, suddenly, successfully, we have internalized thought systems. And the thing that is most responsible for that is language. Language consists of placeholders or systems of references. Now you see what reference frames mean. So when an adult sees the letter L or the letter A, that's a placeholder for a sound. And then when you put all those sounds together, it comprises like a word. Like for a baby, when a baby sees this letter and that letter, it doesn't mean anything. But the more they keep hearing the sound, b, a, b, e, b, e, b, e, it becomes an actual thing. So suddenly there's like a word, an idea, a concept, a reference. So that when it hears that word, it had stored everything it had ever sensed that was about that thing. You know, it could be this thing, it could be like that thing. Every time it sees it, it stores a whole bunch of qualities that allows them to make that like a thing. And so suddenly you have this thing that's filled with reference frames. And those reference frames are now like inside. They're suddenly like a virtual universe, like inside the body that in the past may not have been perceivable like as such. So already that's quite interesting that, wait, sorry, stop share. It's quite interesting that you have this capacity yourself or to bring others into this space of becoming baby-like so that they're not able to think inside. So this possibly explains when, you know, like when sometimes people experience seeing something, and then when they start sharing about it, someone says, oh wow, I saw that too. I saw that too. It's all interconnected, because thinking outside isn't just about thinking through your body or thinking through objects in the world. There are interconnections that the baby experiences intuitively, where everything is a room thinking of itself. So adulthood is basically about becoming an individual, separate from other objects or other people. For babies, there's not actually a separation between the self and the other. So the baby needs to go through this Lacanian concept called the mirror stage, so that when the baby suddenly sees itself in the mirror, it's like, oh wait, I'm not the room. I'm actually this thing that has a name, that's separate from the mom and the object, and an ego is formed. And for you to successfully do that, you need to internalize things. You need to build a time dimension inside yourself that's like a whole library, so that when you hear a word, you know what that is through what's called memory. Babies don't have memories. They don't have the reference system that allows them to separate yesterday and tomorrow. So those structures exist in the body. So when you enter into another dimension, you experience your body differently. So that in the last intensive Zoom call, we talked about the relationship between, the causal relationship between the body, the movement, the thought, and it's hard to explain right now, but for those who've gone through psychedelic experiences or deep inner dance processes, sometimes you know what's happening in the room before it happened, right? You knew someone was going to say that, or the music was going to change before it changed, that somehow you're actually controlling it. So to go back into the baby state, when the body expresses authentically through the energy, you become the cause rather than the effect. It's very hard to explain. It's like a really different conceptualization of time. So philosophically, this is huge, because from a Cartesian perspective, in the think, therefore I am point of view, thought is seen to be the cause of like being, or even body movement. I think this, and then my body's going to move in this way. But in many ways, like movement precedes thought from another dimensionality, and movement seems to be coming from this thing called intentionality, or the universe, or God, or spirit that's moving the thing, so that thought comes after. But within the philosophies and sciences, we basically prioritize thought over everything else. Therefore, I think, therefore, I am is important. So if you wanted to imagine what a retrocausal universe is that is mapped out in the neocortex, like what's the geometry that would at least be helpful? This is like a box that has containers inside, but maybe what things would really look like reference-wise is, for you to arrive at thought, you need to understand how the small objects are contained, inside, let's say, the bigger object. So let's say this is the whole, and the whole is comprised of all these different parts. But the more you experience like a meta language or metacognitive, meta spiritual space, you realize that no, actually, like the big part is actually contained by a bigger part that's connected to all these other parts. So this is just like another part. And maybe you need to scroll back far enough. Don't know if that's possible here. I can't draw anymore, but I would need to draw more circles around the thing, so that we realize that even like this small part has like all these small parts in it. These are the things like people might figure out if they're interested in how learning happens. Like how is something actually a container of many, many small things that's actually contained by a much larger thing. In mathematics, we experience this as sets and subsets, and so thoughts are internalized structured networks within networks within networks within networks, and the public sphere and the personal are dimensions of these. So the more you become ego, the more you try to contain all of these things inside yourself. But somehow when you become like a baby or a universe, your ego is just one part. It's actually like one part of a much bigger thing, a much bigger ego that you might call God or the universe or this and that. So how does growth happen throughout all these? Like, what does these all mean in terms of growth? When a person is lodged in an ego, they're basically thinking that they're one whole made of like a system of parts. I think for the ego to break, there has to be a hermeneutic circle. A hermeneutic circle is an awareness of how are, like these small things are called parts, and this big thing is called a whole. So hermeneutics is about interpretation. Interpretation is an evolutionary principle upon which we start to think of what is true. How do we know if something is good or bad or low or high? And without knowing how parts inside the whole are interrelated that comprise like the whole thing, there is no hermeneutics. There is no one or varied system of how truth becomes real or is conditioned. And I really just do believe that we're getting to understand the brain more and more now. When you're conducting this work, you are facilitating minds and bodies, and you're changing minds and bodies. And then the more you conduct changes in the body, the more you conduct changes in the mind. And then the more you conduct changes in the mind, the more the body will be experienced differently. A lot of what I talked about are like the basic frameworks. You can expand on these. We can talk about these more. These are the beginning conversations and how you can apply this in schools so that you're not just using random sounds or touching the bodies randomly, spontaneously. When you use sound over and above like pictures, you're already doing quite a bit with the basic understanding of what we've talked about. To sum up, here are the basic insights that I'm trying to present to you. Number one, in the spiritual awakening today, there's either a greater interest in activating the old brain or the new brain. It's like, do we make people like reptiles and instinctual, non-thinking people? There's a lot of languaging around many circles around like thought is bad, stop thinking, don't ask questions, don't think for yourself, just follow what the teacher says and keep going into your body. That's like old brain facilitation work. And very rare is it that people are aware of new brain systems, primarily because a lot of what I've talked about are not, some of them aren't even current. They're still in discussion as to how cortical columns, how the neocortex actually functions. A lot of the experiences in spiritual community are actually a little bit more intense knowledge-wise than what's being looked at in conservative science. So you are free to explore how information and thought forms in a way. I think what is practical hold in understanding knowledge and asking how learning happens has to do with what you might support. So when you activate the neocortex, if you, okay, wait, let me just change the screen so it goes into its original look. Okay. So yeah, here are neurons, here are circuits. Let's simplify them. Here you have a connection, connects there, it connects there. You can keep firing things up. You can keep firing neurons, but if you don't wire them, which we're talking about here is long-term potentiation, that happens when you're not afraid and when you're able to establish, like loving, interesting, brilliant, creative elements, part of which is what the music helps to do. Like there are certain musics that will, you're not just there to fire. When you create the conditions where thoughts could form, and a lot of that needs to happen on more stable ground, not super triggering, not necessarily emotionally unstable, where you keep making people cry, you keep making them shout, you keep like firing things up in a Kundalini sense, where activating the body, transmitting the body. If you do that too much, glial cells and the synaptic connections, without proper balance between glutamate and GABA. We've talked about this a lot before. When it's always dopamine, cortisol, epinephrine, these are the catecholamines, the uppers. When you keep firing things up, trying to stimulate them without balancing, without creating homeostasis, what's lacking is the myelination. Myelin is the white sheath. It's the white covering that allows for true neuroplasticity to take place. So that means you're not just needing to stimulate the neural connections, not trying to excite, not trying to drug the nervous system, to try to inhibit at times, to try to slow down, to try to stabilize, means you're creating more white matter rather than just the gray areas of the brain. When you myelinate the connections, that's really how you construct long-term thinking process, long-term potency. What do I want to say about this? So yeah, we've been able to do this. The whitest, the most dense myelinated areas of the brain is that which is responsible for language. The Broca's area, Wernicke's area, responsible for language production, saying the right words, right according to what schools, what your parents, your culture wanted you to say, and then language comprehension, understanding what is being said in accordance to your culture and everything else that you were exposed to in the past. So the most myelinated areas of your mind and your body is basically language. So when you get tired of the old linguistic rules and cultural rules set about by syntactical elements of language, if you wanted to change that, that's when light language happens. So in many ways, it is true that you need to unmyelinate. You need to break down a lot of the old existing connections that you're tired of. So it is acceptable that you do hold enough of the cathartic, the weird, the strange, the things that are normally understood to be the traditional inner dance, where there's this deconstruction, the surrender, the healing, the letting go. You do need to hold that enough. And a lot of that has been discoverable in the past. But what has not really been well understood is what are the stable constructive, the truly creative, the truly structural elements that allow like neuroplasticity, like new connections to happen. So myelination is what we have been working on. Is the reason why we're using new music. We're using less, say, triggering music. Like there's more synaptic connectivity happening with higher neural oscillations, like faster, beyond gamma. But a lot of that needs to be held by deep grounding, like delta states. So a lot of the songy music, the emotional triggering music, the manipulative music, it doesn't really host as much synaptic strengthening, basically. Myelination doesn't always happen within the dopamine hit. And I'm really quite guilty of this in the beginning because my own models were based on mostly the dopaminergic system. When I described that the back of the head is merely the basal ganglia without incorporating what the hypothalamus is and what it does, that brings about autonomic nervous system wisdom or circadian rhythm wisdom. Too much triggering mechanisms that even does that to the hypothalamus does lead to overreactive emotional states that could even lead to aggression, that leads to high temper, non-patient, impatient, trying to hurry, elements that does exist within the spiritual process. Sometimes when we just try to over trigger, what it means to not learn means to build a spiritual ego. And when the mind is unable to hold pattern recognition, is not able to keep within a constant learning process, when people personalize, go into identification, and does not shift into more observant states, that goes into this is a little bit complex, but to remove yourself from the causal relationship, that whether it be concrete experience leads to abstract thought. What comes first? What's the chicken or egg? Is it my body that leads to a thought? Or is it my thinking that leads to how I might sense the world? I think the deep trust of both the body and mind would need to begin with the mandala, which would, experience the colors as vibrations. It speaks about pure trust that everything's happening for a reason, and everything's always leading me to wonder and to love and to evolution, and everything I need is already inside. To start out with what deep trust could bring, this would reformat the brain, basically. If you don't have that level of trust, if you're not vibrating within a sense of the whole that allows the parts to commit to each other, that's going to be harmonic and resonant. If there's still that tinge of ego, fear, and separation there, the construction is always happening. The moment you wake up in the morning, the moment you go to sleep at night, and even the space in between when you're dreaming, the construction is happening still. So what we're discovering in inner dance is, what are the conditions, what are the ways of holding the space, like sonically, like what's our understanding of music right now? Is it something we're interested in that's bringing about these changes? What are the feedbacks? There is a reason why we get irritated and why people get irritated with the new sonic frequencies. It's because we're not used to it. It's because we're still looking for the things that are comfortable and familiar. But even then, there's a part of us that's really quite bored about looping again and again over the same activations of the hypothalamus and the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, the hippocampus region, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So the old and new brain really need to be reformatted And that requires a little bit of discipline on our part, that we're not just studying, we're having to reorder the way the space is being held, like new tools, new framings, new contextualization. So maybe it takes you a little bit of a while to master or to get used to some of these terms, but just like learning a new language, just by exposure, just by being able to talk about this, just by being able to weave these things together, that lands you in a spiritual neuroscience, this understanding of the thing that contains us, that harnesses electricity, magnetism, time, and space. Then for those who are interested in applying this in the long term to family schools and hospitals, the more you hear about it, a construction is already happening. That's how structuralism happens. When you listen to this, there's things happening in your body. I mean, structuralism comes from deconstruction. So when you're hearing it, you're deconstructing it, meaning you're dissecting it. Your body's going through certain changes as dissection happens. And then slowly, when you find yourself in a situation where you would be in a place of trust with other people who are in a place of trust, when you're explaining this in a different way, through your own way, through a way that's new, that's how construction happens. Not just bringing the energy there, which is going to happen because you've been deconstructing, but when you articulate this new picture of the world that's holding, greater degrees of intelligence, you would be surprised that you would find yourself with, like expert practitioners in medicine, education, and all kinds of therapy, because you're backing your work with what's actually happening. What's interesting about the brain science is it's very concrete, meaning the neurons are there. There's no question about that. But the way you imagine it is very abstract. To be able to geometrize, that's not really a word, but to hold the geometry of what could be happening there with more and more awareness, there's a less judgmental way in how you're treating what looks like a physiological material thing. The more you become aware that it's electricity and it's bits of information, it's networks of icons and echoes, and sounds and images, and now I see movement is actually what weaves all of it together. It takes you away from judgment. So whether it be like cancer or this thing that looks like a person, it just helps you perceive how it really is all energy, and how the energy just is not, it's not just energy. It's sophisticated. Okay, so I'll stop talking now. I'm spent. I have another Zoom call at 10 p.m. It's 7. What time did we start? 5. We have an hour possibly for us to discuss. I see a lot of stuff in the chat room. I tried not to look at them because there's a lot. I would have lost my train of thought. You could verbalize like insights, certain questions that come up, ideas, what feelings are provoked. I and others would be interested to hear this being a community call. Feel free to go public with your thoughts. Thank you for listening to mine.
Hi, Miss Oscar. Hi, friends. I'm not sure if I have a good camera. I don't have. Okay. So, well, thank you so much. It was a masterful explanation and deep digging. To me, the feelings of what is releasing on me, the inspiration and the joyfulness of knowing, or at the same time seeing in a different way, or starting to enter in a new layer of self-perception and biological structuring, and how signals electricity starting to becoming how our brain is bringing the world into insight in order to create a solidity, the solid perception, the structure of reality, and how it is inevitable, even if we are going through trauma, through circumstances of things that they are not actually in our evolutionary favor, but of course everything is our working for our highest good. And at the same time, how this structure allows to understand the deconstruction and how the relearning and the change can take place. I really find more accessible the how to say the abstract. I feel that I was touching some clarity in the abstract world during the explanation. The systems of how the abstract is becoming more clear in terms of how inner dance is really far beyond of actually me as a practitioner and student is creating the perception of inner dance, how I perceive it. Yes, I just want to use the word, maybe helping to myself to listening and participating and making feel myself. And yes, it was very, very inspiring. I'm glad you read it from Austria, from Vienna. And well, thank you so much for the time. And it was very beautiful. And I'm still landing from Maya. It's been really take time. I say I need time to integrate all that was happening and finding the way to do it. But it feels like a deep continuation of the process. And I'm super grateful and excited for this community. And well, thank you so much for this calling.
Amazing. Thank you, Oscar. The feedback is beautifully received here. I read through the chat, and I do find the questions quite good. So reading, it's Caro who is asking, what is the relation between fascia network in the body with the neocortex? Yeah, really interesting there. So in the science of embodied cognition, it's normally studied how the mind is embodied, because in traditional philosophy, mind is disembodied, meaning thoughts have no connection with the body at all. So if you're dealing with concepts in that dualistic nature exist out there in the world that has no references in the personal, especially that which, meaning the personal that's material based. Now, philosophy is looking at embodiment more and more. So yeah, fascia, tissues, muscles in the body are still interconnected to the brain through afferent and efferent neurons or nerves, meaning there are nerve pathways that are connected to, let's say you touch something hot, you feel, they're relayed and mapped out in the brain. But what's interesting about static matter as opposed to, let's say, dynamic matter, like matter that is moving, the body that's moving, is when you think of emotions being energy in motion, when you then interrelate energy to the body moving is also emotion. So emotions are basically response mechanisms. So that thought in some way is established based on how you reacted to the world. And those systems are embedded in the fascia. When people think of anatomy, they think of, bones, muscle, tissue, organs. But when you deal with energy, you still would need to think about what is the system that is nearest to energy, and that is the nervous system. So, you know, you do have the muscular system that can move the body, but when you want to relate that to the energetic situation, you would need to understand, how does electricity flow? How does electricity and magnetism help to manage the muscles and the tissue and the organs and the bone structure? So when you think about the insight that thinking is moving, thinking is a form of movement, and movement is a form of thinking. What is in the fascia is just as important as what is fascia itself. So the intelligence within fascia would also correlate with the response mechanisms that are managed by neural and nervous system pathways. So when we're coming from the sympathetic fight or flight or freeze reflex, then the knowledge within fascias would be depressive, when and where there would be avoidant tendencies that come from past experiences of pain or discomfort. But then when we suddenly are able to change our response mechanisms regarding the things that used to be scary to us, that holds us in anxiety, fascia then could hold possibly like new plastic, new flexible connections that are changing, that are new and not based on depressive states. Depression is really more of patterns that were instilled that are you know, leading to disuse, dystrophy, atrophy, not using parts of the mind and not using parts of the body that lay dormant, that lay merely potent and cannot be actualized because of experiences of pain. So what we're trying to do is to construct ways and means in which we can experience connections that might have been there when we were young a long time ago, but may have been depressed or may have been disconnected. So the more variations of stimuli, or just whatever leads to new response mechanisms. That's really what thought could become, you know, like patterns that become relatable to memory. These are old response mechanisms that responded to old reactions and responses that kept reacting in the same way. And through disuse or overuse, we develop habits, you know, memory, like body memory is a habit. And when we keep doing something again and again, or we are not doing something because we are afraid to do it, that's how a body is formed, which is, you know, from bone structure to fascia, musculature, tissue, or organs that sometimes can become like a tumor or cancer and whatnot, to be able to shift elements in the material. Yeah. So yeah, I see a raised hand. Garo, maybe you want to word something based on this. Yeah. And then we have.
Yeah, thank you for the full circle, because I was like full on like thinking when you were talking, and what you just said makes me think like about my experience. Like I got some different actualization, like I think in my brain, and I think it's like also reflecting in my body. As a yoga instructor, I have a lot of awareness of how I position my body and how it is, you know, in my joints and everything. And lately I've been like experiencing like my body being like feeling like even more flexible. I'm quite flexible naturally, but it's even more like it's like a feeling of being younger, kind of like in the body, you know. So it's I don't know if we can say that, but I'm thinking about the is it all what you explained by the you know, storing the informations, like deconstructing and then storing new information to be able to absorb more? Is it the key to understand how healings works? Because if it's happening here, it's gonna descend in the body, you know. So that's how we explain kind of this thing, what's happening to us. Is it right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question that we can interrelate with Mariella just posted.
Yeah, I just saw that at the same time.
It's interesting. It's like when you think about genetic hardwiring, heredity, genes, DNA, there's always this nature versus nurture question, which is the question in evolution. When you think of genetics, then we get trapped by, say, what was in our parents or what was in the ancestry, so that specific behavior, thought patterns, disease mechanisms are imprinted, so it kind of victimizes us. You know, we're stuck with with this natural selection hereditary element. So I think neuroplasticity, concepts and plasticity, is very optimistic. It's very empowering to understand that what you will get exposed to, either from ancestral or environmental concerns, would always be there. And I think we need to still come from this everything happens for a reason construction of the world. That, okay, I did choose my parents because I was born through them. But to have this, have whatever would support the creative locus of control, that we do have creative potency. Everything that I shared supports plasticity at large, that we choose how information is embedded and is maintained, is either reconstructed or is looped. You know, and to achieve this from a meta, you know, if we don't understand what's happening and we're just running blindly, you know, that's one thing. And certain spiritual ways of explaining things can get loopy. Certain spiritual elements can be very, very empowering. So I think we want both. Because if you want to systematize, you want to be able to theorize and to hold a therapy that is consistent, we don't want to just keep making things up. We do want the current, the more advanced understanding that is available for us. So I don't have a stand on heredity. I don't think about genetics so much. Maybe it's because I've dealt with my issues with my mom and dad and the family line, stepped away from it, and I underwent forgiveness. So I think I did do something inside me that broke the genetic hardwiring. I do see people dealing with lineage quite a bit. There are certain cultures that deal with lineage a lot, and I don't invalidate or cancel that out. I do believe that we choose them, those who came before us, but I do believe that they live through us. So from a psycho-spiritual point of view, I think they can make choices differently through us. And I think that's quite interesting and beautiful in a way. So I'd bring genetics there, but I would also bring something more, just as optimistic, that allows us to carry them with us. I don't know if this makes sense, but yeah, I hope this makes sense. Yeah, thank you, Gisney. Interesting suggestion there. Yeah, anything more? This has been quite a call already. It's a Sunday morning, so some of you might have things to do. It would be interesting for some of you to word out what you've been writing, because there's a lot of really good stuff there too.
Hey, could
Mm.
I maybe also contribute? I wrote down so much. This was putting a lot of things into some sort of context, and I had to distance, and I'm coming back to it now. But what I was writing as you were speaking about the neocortex and connecting thinking to what is happening in that authentic experience of movement. I was wondering about the importance of the loop, for example, of repetition, because it seems that there is some wisdom in looping and repeating to allow linearity to fade. And yeah, this was happening at least when speaking about the brain in that sense, and like when we like in that place of the brain where movement is happening. Yeah, I wondered a bit, just like in correlation to the new music and how it's actually like it came to me because I did the REM playlist this morning. I did the sleeping playlist that I thought was actually just playlist, so I was for 2 hours just lost in it, and I realized that there's something there's some wisdom in allowing repetition. Yeah, I guess I'm repeating that.
Yeah, there's something there. Let's go there. It supports this movement from the baby to the adult that's in developmental psychology. So the primary theorists in developmental psychology are Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky, the Russian linguist, came up with this very interesting proposal on how the baby transforms into an adult, which happens from, between public speech. The baby is authentic and everything it is thinking it's always thinking it out loud. So how are we able to think internally, secretly and privately, that it's possible through the internalization and structuralization of thought, creating this library of thought. So his proposal to help the understanding of this, which he did bring into experimentation, testing rigorously, he observed how babies need to do repetition. If you spend time with babies, they're always in repetition. They're always looping, especially taking things out, putting things inside containers. When I spent time with Johanna's children, they were repeating each other all the time, whether it be the older or the younger, but mostly the younger kept repeating everything that the older was doing. And then when I was moving, then she kept repeating what I was doing. So Vygotsky's explanation of this is that somehow, for example, when you're going into language, you need to embed meaning into the sound. Because when you make sounds as a baby, the sounds don't really mean anything. Maybe it means something to the baby, but conventionally it doesn't mean anything because it doesn't match the sound of the culture. So the baby has to keep saying the sound again and again so that the sound would start to hold a meaning that becomes like a word. But this is not really possible unless the images that are actually hiding inside the sound that's in the word is, and then there's the body language, there's prosody, there's certain ways of speaking the word that holds just as much meaning. So you have to loop for it to habituate or become like an actual place holding thing. The loop is important. So that can be done through sound, it could be done through seeing the object again and again, hardwiring the visual cortex, where the retina and the visual the occipital lobe, starts to network the thing. So I think this is relevant for babies, but for people in a process of transformation, when pilgrims tend to go deep, either through, like a spiritual way, a psychedelic way, when they become like children, wiping out old patterns, there has to be somehow an understanding of how adults becoming baby-like become new people. So when I observe this, either through people doing light language or experiencing the body in a different way, losing control of the old body and experiencing new movements, what I see is normally, for example, people start to resonate with certain words. They start to notice synchronicities that connect certain concepts together that in the past weren't connected. That's partly people going into new language acquisition, new resonances, because when they want to change, they need to change the way they think, and language structures thinking. So learning to speak and listen in a different way allows for new semantic, iconic, and echoic networks to happen. So it starts with a lot of chaos, but then when you become someone new, you really need discipline. There needs to be new habitual ways. So when there's an oversimplification on, let's say, certain spiritual terms, certain, there's a lack of complexity that's required for real growth to happen. So studying is really important. It's really important that we locate ourselves near people who can hold more structure. That like learning a new language, you expose or immerse yourself, and then next thing you know, I think I understand this through repetition. So disciplines would be to expose yourself to sounds, to be in orality, to listen, to be in dialogue. But then there would be a time when you pick up the books, you pick up you start to read again. And then suddenly you can write again. That's not really the messy notes that we tend to make when we're in some of these dialogues. To learn to structure means to adapt to all of these wisdom traditions, these channels or modes of communication, which does take years sometimes. It takes time. So we don't want to rush from the baby or toddler state of the spiritual awakening, because we do want to hold more information in the beginning, which is what babies and toddlers are able to do before structure starts to appear. And often that's why we train. That's why we want to do this work, because that's sometimes the best way to hold chaos and order at the same time, intuitively, and later through a new set of logics, ontologic, metalogic. So yeah, we're becoming babies in baby's loop. We need to make sure that it's like when you loop new words or new habits in this new way, as like a baby-like person, the word that you're holding or the movement you're holding just packs in a lot more than you were able to when it was the same movement or word as a child. It just means more. So it's okay to loop, but holding more information that's not actually loopy. It's not just a word anymore. It's not just an act anymore. It's holding complexity. It's growth. Thank you. Yeah, so I think we can close soon. Yeah, something pragmatic. For those who are using the Noise app, a lot of what was talked about today is very interlinked with the usage of more noises and more, like, less musical forms, more noises. The new playlists may not be noise-based, they're vibratory, but they're close to what the noise apps are doing. They're just pushing the neural frequency coupling to another level that's holding delta gamma in next dimensional states. But to start out with a more simple platform, the noise app would be it, So when I talk about cortical columns and the neocortex, that if you're already using the noise app, you're basically spreading activation throughout the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes, both hemispheres of the brain, the neocortex at large, that's holding less emotional trigger mechanisms, less anger, less aggression, less dopaminergic addictive systems, which is what allows future intelligence to arise. So I'm merely maybe affirming something you're already acting upon, and that would have great insights applicable to both schools and hospitals and new ways of approaching spiritual modality. And I do believe some of these explanations would be kind of important. You can take your time, but when you're facilitating, you would notice how maybe some of your expressions would change now that we are going more into the new brain rather than old brain structure. We've talked about the reptilian brain so much, and we like to think about instinct, intuition, the body intelligence, but we're not really so adept at understanding like how this higher order thinking get mapped out. It's not just like emotional, energetic activations. So think of your map more. Think of your neocortex, that you have this amazing network of everything that's ever been seen and ever been heard, and that you're constantly mapping out. I mean, just thinking about closing your eyes sometimes and thinking about the prediction capacities of your fingers, that it knows what the thing is because it's taking in all of these things it's hearing, and it's creating a shaping of the world. I saw your faces when I was talking about the fuzziness of what you're actually receiving in V1 and V2. I could see a lot of people nodding when I was saying you're making things up. It's not really there clear as you think it is. You're merely, there's a democracy inside you that's creating this process voting that says, oh, I think that's what it is. But that's really just a prediction. It's you're making things up. Data already helps you to become more of a dreamer than a victim. It already helps you to create the world by understanding. It's not so clear. It's not clear, so don't judge yourself when sometimes it's not clear, because in reality, it's actually not clear. It's your mind and body that's making you believe that your judgment, what you think about a thing, is really what it is, but it's not what it is. It's a system of interpretation. So get ready for clarity that comes from not clear. Stop judging yourself sometimes when you're fuzzy, because that's really what it is. Okay, so thank you for being here. I really enjoyed this call. I want you to know that to get to this, it actually takes me a lot to hold a lot of these pieces together. It might seem really coherent, but holding these connections take a little bit of effort, and I'm glad we went to the mountains last week so that I could finally catch up even with the integration of old brain, new brain, higher and lower intelligence that's just been there, but I just haven't gotten around to things. So that's an offering. I think especially because we're working with schools, part of me wants to come into integrity with explaining how does learning really happen, because teachers don't actually know how learning happens. They don't have a theory of how learning happens. What we went over today incorporates spiritual elements, emotions, body, the dance, movement, all of these, the senses, all of these coming together establishes how you create or form a thought. We just defined how do you form a thought. It's sensory motor, it's location. It's like putting things in place, and that's actually quite beautiful to get to. Maybe later we'll have more spiritual explanations to the scientific elucidations, but I think we deserve to know how knowing happens. Okay, so unmute and let's say good night, good morning to some, afternoon.
Hi. Hello.
Oh,
Hello.
it's a boy.
Nice to meet
It's a girl.
Introduce yourself. Our future inner dance. My
Hello.
Bye. Thank you for amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It was amazing. Bye.
Baby.
Bye.
Bye bye.